She was invisible to everyone at City General Hospital. Just another cleaning woman emptying trash cans and mopping floors. Until the night, a 7-year-old boy was brought in with a brain hemorrhage and all the surgeons were unavailable. What she did in that operating room would reveal an identity that the medical world thought was dead. Welcome to Those Who Left a Trace, where ordinary people carry the most extraordinary secrets. Before we dive into this incredible story that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about second chances and hidden talents, tell us in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe that sometimes the most skilled hands belong to the most overlooked people, hit that subscribe button and join our community of storytellers. Linda had been invisible for exactly 4 years, 7 months, and 12 days. Not that anyone at City General Hospital was counting, especially not the doctors who hurried past in the corridors without a second glance, or the nurses who barely acknowledged her presence as she emptied their wastebaskets and sanitized their workstations. At 42 years old, she stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, with graying brown hair that she kept pulled back in a simple ponytail beneath her standard-issue cleaning cap. Her hazel eyes, though tired from years of night shifts and emotional exhaustion, still held a sharpness that no one bothered to notice. She wore the navy blue uniform of the hospital's custodial staff, her movement efficient and practiced as she navigated the endless hallways with her cart full of supplies, invisible to a world that had forgotten she existed. The transformation from Dr. Linda Catherine Hayes, one of the most promising neurosurgeons on the East Coast, to Linda the night janitor had not happened overnight. It had been a gradual descent into anonymity, orchestrated by a malpractice lawsuit that had destroyed her reputation, her career, and very nearly her will to live. The case had been built on fabricated evidence and paid testimony, orchestrated by a pharmaceutical company called Meridian Industries that wanted to silence her research into experimental brain surgery techniques that threatened their profit margins from traditional chemotherapy drugs. Dr. Hayes had been developing a revolutionary surgical approach for treating pediatric brain tumors, a minimally invasive technique that could remove cancerous tissue with unprecedented precision while preserving healthy brain function. Her preliminary results had been extraordinary, with survival rates that exceeded anything achieved through conventional treatment. Children who would have died within months using traditional protocols were not only surviving, but thriving, returning to school and normal activities with minimal long-term effects from their surgeries. The technique itself was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of the massive craniotomies traditionally required for tumor removal, Linda had developed a series of micro-incisions that could be made through the skull using specialized instruments no larger than pencils. Guided by real-time MRI imaging, she could navigate through brain tissue with precision measured in millimeters, removing cancerous cells while leaving healthy neurons completely untouched. The recovery time was reduced from months to weeks, and the cognitive side effects that plagued traditional brain surgery patients were virtually eliminated. But her success had threatened to disrupt a billion-dollar industry built on expensive drug therapies that generated massive profits for companies like Meridian Industries. The company's flagship drug, cerebrotoxin, was a chemotherapy agent specifically designed for pediatric brain tumors that cost families upward of $50,000 per treatment cycle. Linda's surgical technique could potentially eliminate the need for chemotherapy in 60% of cases, representing a loss of hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue for Meridian. The lawsuit had been meticulously planned, beginning with the recruitment of a patient's family, who had been paid substantial sums to claim that Dr. Hayes had performed unnecessary surgery on their child. The Hendricks family had been approached by Meridian representatives just 3 months after their daughter Emma had undergone successful tumor removal surgery. Emma had recovered completely, returning to her normal activities as a healthy 8-year-old. But the family was offered $200,000 to claim that the surgery had been experimental and unnecessary, that traditional chemotherapy would have been equally effective. False medical records had been created showing complications that never occurred. Expert witnesses had been bought with consulting contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and a media campaign had been launched to destroy Linda's reputation before the case ever reached trial. Medical journals that had once featured her research suddenly published articles questioning her methods. Colleagues who had once sought her expertise began avoiding her calls. Hospital administrators who had once competed for her services started expressing concerns about her surgical protocols. By the time Linda understood what was happening, Her medical license had been suspended pending investigation. Her hospital privileges had been revoked, and her name had become synonymous with medical malpractice in the minds of both her colleagues and the general public. The legal battle had consumed her savings, her energy, and her faith in the system she had dedicated her life to serving. Even when independent investigators eventually uncovered evidence of the conspiracy against her, the damage had been done. The truth had emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. A whistleblower at Meridian Industries had provided internal documents showing the company's systematic campaign to discredit Linda's work. Financial records revealed payments to expert witnesses who had testified against her. Audio recordings captured executives discussing strategies for eliminating the threat posed by her surgical innovations. But by the time these revelations came to light, Linda's career was already destroyed beyond repair. Meridian Industries had paid nominal fines totaling less than the cost of their annual Christmas party and continued their operations without missing a quarterly earnings target. The executives responsible for conspiracy received bonuses for protecting company profits. The expert witnesses who had provided false testimony faced no consequences beyond mild rebukes from their professional organizations. Meanwhile, Linda found herself blacklisted from every major medical institution in the country. Her research discontinued. Her patients transferred to other surgeons who lacked her expertise. The colleagues who had once sought her expertise now crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. The patients whose lives she had saved forgot her name or pretended not to recognize her when she encountered them in grocery stores or shopping malls. The medical journals that had once featured her research refused to publish her work, claiming concerns about her credibility despite the evidence of her innocence. She had become a pariah in the very field she had revolutionized, a cautionary tale about the dangers of challenging established interests. Her personal life had disintegrated along with her career. Her husband, Dr. Richard Chun, had filed for divorce 6 months after her license was suspended, claiming that the scandal had damaged his own reputation as a cardiologist. Their shared circle of friends, all medical professionals, had gradually stopped returning her calls and inviting her to social gatherings. Even her own parents, both retired physicians themselves, had struggled to understand how their daughter could have found herself at the center of such a controversy. The isolation had been nearly unbearable. Linda had spent months in her empty apartment, surviving on savings that dwindled with alarming speed, watching her life's work disappear as if it had never existed. She had considered suicide more than once during those dark months, standing on the balcony of her 20th floor apartment and wondering if falling might be preferable to the slow death of professional extinction. Only the memory of the children she had saved, and the knowledge that there might be others she could still help somehow, had kept her from taking that final step. But City General had been different. The human resources director, a woman named Patricia Chun who had lost her own daughter to a brain tumor 20 years earlier, had been willing to overlook Linda's past when she applied for a custodial position under her maiden name. Perhaps out of pity, perhaps out of intuition that recognized something familiar in Linda's eyes, or perhaps because qualified night custodians were genuinely difficult to find, Patricia had offered Linda a job cleaning the very hospital floors where she had once saved lives. Linda had taken the position gratefully, telling herself it was temporary, just until she could rebuild her life and find a way back to medicine. She had no savings left, no prospects for employment in her field, and no realistic hope of ever practicing surgery again. The custodial job paid enough to cover rent on a small apartment and basic living expenses, and it allowed her to remain connected, however tangentially, to the medical world she loved. That had been 4 years ago, and she was still pushing the same cart down the same corridors, cleaning up after the doctors who were doing the work she had once loved more than life itself. Her apartment was a cramped studio 15 minutes from the hospital, furnished with secondhand furniture from thrift stores and garage sales. The walls were lined with medical textbooks that she couldn't bring herself to throw away, their spines faded but their contents still sharp in her memory. Every night after her shift, she would sit at her small kitchen table and read the latest surgical journals, keeping up with advances in neurosurgery that she would never again be allowed to practice. It was a form of psychological torture that she couldn't abandon, like pressing on a bruise to remind herself that the injury was still there. She watched her field evolve without her, saw other surgeons receive credit for techniques she had pioneered, read about breakthrough surgeries that used methods she had been the first to develop. The medical journals arrived monthly, addressed to Linda Hayes rather than Dr. Hayes, a small reminder of everything she had lost. She had maintained her subscriptions even when she could barely afford groceries, treating them as a necessary connection to the world she had been forced to leave behind. Each article was a knife twist in the wound of her exile, but she couldn't stop reading them. They were her only remaining link to the person she had once been. Her routine was as predictable as clockwork, a carefully constructed schedule that helped her navigate the emotional minefield of working in a hospital where she could save lives, but wasn't allowed to do so. She arrived at the hospital at 11 p.m., changed into her uniform in the basement locker room shared by the custodial staff, and began her rounds on the 7th floor, working her way down through the building until she reached the emergency department on the ground level. She cleaned operating rooms where she had once performed miracles, scrubbed floors where she had once walked as one of the most respected surgeons in the country, and emptied trash cans filled with medical waste from procedures she could have performed with her eyes closed. The irony was bitter but inescapable. She was literally cleaning up after people who were less qualified than her to do the work they were doing. The other members of the custodial staff had long since stopped trying to include her in their conversations or their after-work gatherings at Murphy's Diner across the street. Linda was polite but distant, professional but never personal, helpful but never revealing. She had perfected the art of being present without being noticed, of moving through spaces without leaving impression, of existing without truly living. They knew her as Linda, the quiet woman who worked efficiently and never complained, who covered extra shifts when needed and never asked for favors in return. They had no idea that she held 2 medical degrees from Johns Hopkins, had published more than 40 peer-reviewed papers in prestigious journals, and had once been featured on the cover of Journal of Neurosurgery as one of the most promising young surgeons in America. They didn't know that she spoke 4 languages fluently, had completed residencies in both neurosurgery and pediatric surgery, and had been offered positions at Harvard, Stanford, and the Mayo Clinic before her career was destroyed. The hospital itself had changed dramatically during her 4 years of exile. New wings had been added, state-of-the-art equipment had been installed, and a complete renovation of the neurosurgery department had transformed it into one of the most advanced surgical facilities on the East Coast. Linda had watched these changes from the shadows, cleaning the construction dust from newly installed equipment that she was no longer allowed to touch, mopping the floors of operating rooms that featured technology she had only read about in journals. The new MRI machines were capable of real-time imaging during surgery, exactly the kind of technology that could have made her minimally invasive techniques even more effective. The surgical robots could perform operations with precision measured in fractions of millimeters, guided by computer systems that eliminated human error from delicate procedures. The recovery rooms were equipped with monitoring systems that could detect complications hours before they became life-threatening. Dr. Robert Franklin had been hired as the new chief of neurosurgery 2 years earlier, brought in from Johns Hopkins with great fanfare and a reputation for innovative surgical techniques. Linda had watched him work from a distance, noting his competent but unexceptional skills, his tendency toward conservative approaches that favored proven methods over experimental techniques. He was a solid surgeon, the kind of dependable professional that hospital administrators preferred, but he lacked a visionary insight that had once made Linda's work revolutionary. The irony was not lost on her that Dr. Franklin now occupied the office that should have been hers, performed surgeries in operating rooms that had been designed according to specifications she had helped develop, and supervised a neurosurgery program that had been built on the foundation of her research. He had even published papers that cited her earlier work, though he was careful to distance himself from her name and reputation. In the medical world's collective memory, Dr. Linda Hayes had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of pushing boundaries too far, rather than a pioneer whose work had advanced the field by decades. But on this particular Tuesday night in November, everything was about to change because of a 7-year-old boy named Michael Patterson, whose parents had been driving home from a soccer game when a drunk driver named Thomas Brennan ran a red light at the intersection of Maple Street and Highway 47. The impact had sent their Honda Accord spinning into a concrete barrier at 60 miles per hour, killing Michael's parents instantly, but leaving the boy alive in the wreckage with severe traumatic brain injury that would require immediate surgical intervention to save his life. Michael had been playing midfielder for the Riverside Elementary Warriors, wearing jersey number 7 and grass-stained cleats that his father had bought him for his birthday 3 months earlier. He was small for his age, but fast, with the kind of fearless determination that made him dive for balls that other children wouldn't even attempt to reach. His parents, David and Mary Patterson, had been discussing his performance during the drive home, debating whether to sign him up for a more competitive league next season. The drunk driver who ended their lives had been Thomas Brennan, a construction worker who had spent the evening at Flanagan Bar drowning his sorrows after losing his job that morning. His blood alcohol level would later be measured at 0.18, more than twice the legal limit, and investigators would find that he had been traveling at nearly 70 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone when he ran the red light. He would survive the crash with minor injuries and eventually serve 18 months in prison for vehicular manslaughter, a sentence that Michael's grandmother would later describe as insultingly inadequate. The paramedics who extracted Michael from the destroyed vehicle were experienced professionals who had seen their share of traffic accidents, but even they were shaken by the severity of the boy's injuries. His Glasgow Coma Scale score was dropping rapidly. His pupils were unequal and sluggishly reactive, and the CT scan performed in the ambulance showed massive cerebral swelling with evidence of subdural hematoma that was compressing vital brain structures. The paramedic team leader, a veteran named Carlos Rodriguez who had been working emergency medicine for 15 years, radioed ahead to City General with a grim assessment. The boy had minutes, not hours, before irreversible brain damage would make survival impossible. Even if they could save his life, Rodriguez feared that the delay in treatment would leave him permanently disabled, dependent on others for the most basic functions of daily living. The ambulance had rushed him to City General because it was the closest level 1 trauma center, but they had arrived during what would later be remembered as the worst possible shift change in the hospital's history. Dr. Franklin, the chief of neurosurgery, was in Chicago attending the annual Congress of Neurological Surgeons, where he was presenting a paper on surgical approaches to pediatric brain tumors based largely on research that Linda had pioneered 5 years earlier. Dr. Angela Chun, his deputy and the most experienced pediatric neurosurgeon on staff, was in the middle of a 12-hour surgery attempting to remove a massive tumor from the brain of a 16-year-old girl named Rebecca Walsh. The tumor was wrapped around critical brain structures that controlled speech and motor function, requiring surgical precision that couldn't be rushed or interrupted. Dr. Chun had been working for 8 hours already and estimated another 4 hours before the procedure would be complete. Dr. Rodriguez, the attending neurosurgeon who normally handled emergency cases, was at home with severe food poisoning that had left him bedridden and unable to stand, let alone perform delicate brain surgery. Dr. Kim, the senior resident, was in the middle of her own emergency surgery, repairing damage from a motorcycle accident that had left a young man named Tyler Brooks with multiple skull fractures and bleeding in 3 different areas of his brain. The only neurosurgeon available was Dr. Williams, a first-year resident who had been out of medical school for less than 6 months and had never performed a craniotomy without direct supervision from an attending physician. He was 27 years old, brilliant in theory, but terrifyingly inexperienced in practice. The kind of doctor who could recite every page of Gray's Anatomy, but had never faced a situation where a child's life depended entirely on his surgical skills. Dr. Williams stood in the emergency room, his hands visibly trembling as he reviewed Michael's CT scans on the computer monitor. The images showed exactly what the paramedics had described: a massive subdural hematoma on the left side of the boy's brain, with dangerous swelling that was compressing the brain stem and threatening to cause herniation. It was the kind of injury that required immediate surgical intervention by an experienced neurosurgeon, not a nervous resident who had only observed similar procedures during his training. Linda was cleaning the hallway outside the trauma unit when she heard commotion, the urgent voices of emergency room staff calling for a neurosurgeon, any neurosurgeon, to come immediately. She paused in her mopping and listened as Dr. Williams tried to explain to Dr. Henderson, the attending emergency physician, that he wasn't qualified to perform the surgery alone, that they needed to transfer the patient to another hospital, that there had to be another option beside allowing a first-year resident to attempt a procedure that could kill the patient if performed incorrectly. But there wasn't another option. The nearest hospital with an available neurosurgeon was Presbyterian Medical Center, 43 minutes away by ambulance, and Michael's intracranial pressure was rising so rapidly that he would be dead within 30 minutes if someone didn't relieve the pressure on his brain. The helicopter ambulance service was grounded due to heavy fog that had rolled in from the coast, making air transport impossible. Even if they could stabilize the boy for transport, which was unlikely given his rapidly deteriorating condition, he would die before they could get him to someone qualified to save his life. Linda found herself walking toward the trauma room, her feet moving without conscious direction, her mind already calculating the surgical approach that would be required to save the child's life. She had performed this exact procedure 47 times during her career, including emergency craniotomies on children even younger than Michael. She knew exactly which instruments would be needed, which approach would minimize trauma to healthy brain tissue, which techniques would give the boy the best chance of surviving with his cognitive function intact. She stopped at the doorway and looked at the boy on the gurney, his small face swollen and bruised beyond recognition, his dark hair matted with blood that the nurses hadn't been able to completely clean away. His chest rose and fell with the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator that was keeping him alive, but Linda could see in the monitor readings that his brain was dying minute by minute. His intracranial pressure had risen to dangerous levels, and the CT scan showed that the hemorrhage was expanding, compressing brain tissue that controlled everything from his ability to walk to his capacity for independent thought. This was the moment that would define the rest of her life. She could walk away, return to her cart, and continue mopping floors. Let Dr. Williams attempt a surgery. He wasn't qualified to perform, and watch a 7-year-old boy die because she was too afraid to reveal who she really was. Or she could step forward, expose herself to all the risks that had terrified her for 4 years, and do what she had been trained to do: save lives. Dr. Williams was pacing beside the gurney, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of helpless frustration, muttering about protocols and liability and the impossibility of the situation. The nurses were preparing for an emergency transport to Presbyterian Medical Center, but Linda could see in their faces that they knew it was too late, that the boy would die before they could get him to someone who could help him. His parents were already dead. His grandparents were flying in from Portland and wouldn't arrive until morning. And he was going to die alone in a hospital room because the one person who could save him was standing in the hallway wearing a janitor's uniform and was too afraid to reveal who she really was. She took a step into the room, then another, until she was standing beside the gurney looking down at Michael Patterson, whose life was ebbing away while trained medical professionals stood helplessly around him. Dr. Williams didn't notice her at first, too focused on his own panic and the impossible decision he was being asked to make. But when he did see her, his expression was one of irritation rather than surprise. "Excuse me," he said curtly, his voice tight with stress and exhaustion. "This is a restricted area. You'll need to finish cleaning this room later." Linda didn't move. She was studying the boy's pupils with the practiced eye of someone who had seen this exact condition dozens of times before, noting the asymmetry that indicated increased pressure on the left side of his brain. His Glasgow Coma Scale score was dropping steadily, and she could see the subtle signs of brain herniation that meant they had minutes, not hours, before permanent damage became inevitable. "Doctor," she said quietly, her voice carrying authority that made Dr. Williams pause mid-sentence. "This child needs an emergency craniotomy to relieve intracranial pressure. The approach should be a left frontoparietal craniotomy with duroplasty. You'll need to remove approximately a 4-inch section of skull to access the hemorrhage and evacuate the clot." Dr. Williams stared at her as if she had suddenly started speaking in ancient Greek. "I'm sorry, who are you exactly? Are you a nurse? A technician? How do you know anything about craniotomies?" Linda looked at him for a long moment, then at the boy whose life was slipping away while they talked about credentials and protocols. She thought about 4 years of invisibility, for years of watching other people do the work she had been born to do, for years of letting fear and shame dictate her choices, while children died because she was too cowardly to risk exposing herself again. "I'm someone who can save this child's life," she said simply, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "But you need to decide right now whether you're going to let me do it or whether you're going to watch him die, because you're too afraid to take a chance on someone whose credentials don't match her uniform." The silence that followed was broken only by the steady beeping of the cardiac monitor and the mechanical whisper of the ventilator. Dr. Williams looked from Linda to the boy and back again, his face cycling through confusion, desperation, and something that might have been hope. "I don't understand," Dr. Williams said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do you know about craniotomies? How do you know any of this? Who are you?" Linda was already moving toward the sink, washing her hands with a methodical precision that she had learned 15 years earlier and had practiced thousands of times in operating rooms across the country. "Because I performed this exact surgery 47 times in my career, and I've never lost a patient to complications that could have been prevented with proper technique. Now are you going to assist me, or are you going to watch this child die while you worry about liability and protocols?"